They told you fast food showed up because people were busy, that it was about convenience, efficiency, affordability, that it filled a gap the market created. That story collapses the moment you look at when fast food flooded black neighborhoods, not the 1950s, not the early boom years. It happened after April 4th, 1968. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. Within days, more than 100 cities erupt: Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore, Washington, D.C. Blocks burn, businesses are destroyed, entire corridors go dark. Here's the part nobody teaches you. When the fires stopped, black communities tried to rebuild, and they were blocked systematically. Insurance companies came first. They assessed the damage, recalculated risk, and quietly changed classifications. Entire neighborhoods were labeled uninsurable. Without insurance, banks refused loans. Without loans, grocery stores couldn't reopen. Pharmacies couldn't rebuild. Family restaurants disappeared. This wasn't chaos. This was policy. In city after city, the same thing happened. The businesses that had anchored black neighborhoods for decades were frozen out of existence, not by fire, by paperwork. Food systems were amputated, and that created a problem. Millions of people still needed to eat. That's when fast food moved in, not immediately. They waited. They watched desperation rise. They let white flight drain capital to the suburbs. They let supermarkets follow the money out. Then, once the landscape was empty, they arrived. Cheap food, bright signs. Franchises framed as opportunity. This wasn't coincidence, it was sequencing. Fast food didn't replace grocery stores, it replaced nothing. It entered a vacuum that had been engineered. By the early 1970s, the pattern was clear. White suburbs gained full-service supermarkets and sit-down restaurants. Black neighborhoods gained drive-thrus and dollar menus. Same cities, different futures. They called it urban development. They called it access. But access to what? Highly processed calories, short shelf lives, low nutritional value, maximum repeat consumption. This wasn't about feeding people well, it was about feeding people cheaply and often. And here's where the lie deepens. Fast food companies didn't just open locations, they embedded themselves. They studied density, traffic flow, income cycles, even benefit distribution schedules. They learned exactly when money hit households, and they timed promotions accordingly. That's not marketing creativity. That's extraction strategy. By the mid-1970s, something unprecedented existed in America. Neighborhoods where it was easier to buy a burger than an apple, where children could walk past multiple fast food restaurants and still not reach a grocery store. That didn't happen in white neighborhoods, and it didn't happen accidentally. Fast food executives knew the health data. They knew rates of heart disease and metabolic illness were already higher in black communities. They knew poverty meant people needed calories, not options. They knew limited mobility meant proximity mattered more than preference. So they designed dependency. Fast food became not a choice, but the default. Then they added a second layer, franchising. On paper, it looked like black ownership. In reality, it was controlled extraction. Corporate owned the land. Corporate controlled suppliers. Corporate set pricing. Corporate collected fees. Franchise owners carried the risk. The community carried the health cost. Corporate collected the profit. For every dollar spent, most of it left the neighborhood permanently. This is where the old civil rights conversation falls short. This wasn't segregation by law, it was segregation by infrastructure. No signs, no slurs, No fire hoses, just zoning, insurance, marketing budgets. Control what food is available, and you control lifespan, productivity, and long-term medical cost. That's power. By the time anyone noticed the damage, it was already normalized. Fast food wasn't seen as an intrusion. It was seen as what neighborhoods looked like. But that normalization was the final stage, because once something feels normal, it stops being questioned. And that raises the real issue. If fast food didn't arrive by accident, and it didn't arrive evenly, and it didn't arrive harmlessly, then the question isn't whether it changed Black America. Once fast food established presence, the next move was consolidation. This wasn't about a single restaurant on a corner. It was about density. Fast food corporations didn't just open locations. They clustered them. 2, 3, 4 within walking distance, sometimes across the street from each other. That wasn't inefficiency. That was dominance. The goal wasn't to compete. The goal was to remove alternatives. Local Black-owned restaurants couldn't survive that pressure, not because their food was worse, because they didn't have corporate backing. A family-owned spot operates on thin margins. Fast food chains don't. Corporate locations could run at a loss for months or years. Losses subsidized by suburban stores. Losses tolerated because the objective wasn't profit in year one. It was elimination. When a local restaurant closed, the chain didn't just gain customers. It removed a competitor permanently. That pattern repeated city after city. And once independent food disappeared, pricing power followed. Fast food became the only option. And when you're the only option, you set the terms. Now here's the part most people miss. Fast food companies didn't just outcompete local businesses. They rewrote the rules so competition couldn't return. Zoning. City councils quietly adjusted land use policies. Permits for fast food became routine. Permits for grocery stores became complicated. Environmental reviews, parking requirements, traffic impact studies. Delays that killed momentum. Delays that cost money small operators didn't have. Internal documents later showed corporate lawyers were involved, not advising, drafting. This wasn't lobbying for opportunity, it was lobbying for exclusion. Street vendors were restricted. Food trucks were capped. Fresh food initiatives were studied indefinitely. Fast food permits approved in weeks. That's not market demand. That's legal insulation. By the 1980s, the system was locked in. Fast food controlled the landscape. Local ownership was gone. Grocery access collapsed. And then came the second phase, marketing. This wasn't generic advertising. This was precision targeting. Corporations poured money into Black radio, Black magazines, Black community events. They didn't sell food, they sold belonging. Fast food was framed as community support, as youth opportunity, as cultural presence. They sponsored sports leagues in neighborhoods without supermarkets. They funded school programs while selling meals that guaranteed repeat customers. They hired Black marketing executives who understood the psychology, not to empower communities, to optimize consumption. Processed food was wrapped in cultural language. Corporate profit dressed as representation, and it worked. By the late 1980s, spending patterns shifted dramatically. Black households spent far more of their food budget on fast food than white households, not because of preference, because of access. Children in these neighborhoods consume fast food multiple times per week, not occasionally, regularly. This wasn't happening everywhere. It was concentrated, and the health data followed. Obesity rates climbed faster than national averages. Metabolic illnesses appeared earlier. Medical costs rose. But here's the key point. The corporations knew this would happen. They had the data before expansion. They tracked outcomes in real time. They adjusted menus, portion sizes, and pricing accordingly. This wasn't ignorance. It was risk calculation. Cheap calories ensured volume. Volume ensured profit. Health consequences were externalized. Communities absorbed the cost. Hospitals absorbed the burden. Corporations collected revenue. And when criticism started to surface, the response was predictable. They introduced healthier options, not to change behavior, to neutralize backlash. Salads added to menus where burgers still dominated sales. Apple slices marketed while advertising budgets remained focused on core products. They funded studies. They donated to health organizations. They sponsored awareness campaigns that avoided naming causes. This wasn't reform. It was containment. By the early 1990s, fast food wasn't just present in black neighborhoods, it defined them. Food deserts weren't accidental outcomes. They were engineered environments. And then came the most effective shield of all, franchising black ownership. On the surface, it looked like empowerment, black faces, black managers, black spokespeople. But ownership was limited. Control wasn't. Corporate dictated supply chains. Corporate owned the property. Corporate collected rent, fees, and mandatory purchases. Franchise owners worked longer hours for thinner margins. Communities blamed them when health issues rose. Corporate stayed invisible. That design wasn't incidental. It was intentional. If criticism came, corporations could point elsewhere. If resistance formed, it fractured internally. This is where the system fully matured. Control without visibility. Extraction without accountability. And once that model proved successful, other industries took notes. But before we go there, one question matters. If fast food companies needed desperation, abandonment, and policy changes to succeed, why were these exact conditions allowed to exist in the first place? By the time fast food dominated black neighborhoods, the damage wasn't just economic, it was biological. This is where intent becomes impossible to deny. Fast food corporations tracked health outcomes, not vaguely, precisely. They knew which neighborhoods had higher rates of diabetes, heart disease, and hypertension before expansion. They knew poverty pushed people toward cheap calories. They knew limited grocery access meant repeat consumption, and they expanded anyway. This wasn't negligence. It was a business model that assumed illness as a cost of doing business. Cheap ingredients, high sugar, high salt, high fat. Food engineered to override satiety. You don't eat it once, you crave it. That's not accidental chemistry. That's product design. Internal industry research showed exactly how often people would return. They tested portion sizes. They tested pricing thresholds. They tested flavor intensity. The goal wasn't nourishment, it was frequency. More visits, more volume, more extraction. And when the health consequences started appearing in hospitals, the response wasn't to slow expansion. It was to double down. The 1980s made conditions even more favorable. Unemployment rose. Public assistance was cut. Urban infrastructure declined further. Fast food chains didn't see crisis. They saw opportunity. Promotions were timed around benefit distribution dates. Advertising intensity spiked at the beginning and middle of the month. That's documented. They weren't guessing when families had money. They knew. This meant government assistance flowed directly into corporate revenue streams. Public funds became private profit, and no one voted on it. At the same time, corporations refined targeting. They didn't market broadly, they segmented. Single-parent households, long work hours, limited cooking facilities. They knew who controlled food decisions in the household, they marketed accordingly. This wasn't persuasion, it was behavioral mapping. Then came the most controversial move, targeting youth. Not subtly, deliberately. Research showed brand loyalty formed early. Children influenced household purchases, especially where time and money were limited. So fast food became an environment, not just a meal. Play areas, toys, birthday packages. Not because communities needed them, because they guaranteed lifetime customers. This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because once habits are formed early, choice becomes constrained later. You don't crave what you never learned to eat. You don't miss what you were never offered. This isn't personal failure, it's conditioning. By the early 1990s, the data was undeniable. Fast food consumption rates in black neighborhoods far exceeded national averages. Health disparities widened. Medical costs skyrocketed. Yet expansion continued. Why? Because illness didn't hurt the business. It sustained it. People don't stop eating when they're sick. They often eat more of what's familiar. And familiar had been engineered. This is where fast food stopped being a restaurant industry and became a health extraction system. It didn't just sell meals, it monetized outcomes. Shorter lifespans meant more repeat customers in compressed time frames. Higher illness rates meant communities had less energy, less capital, less capacity to resist. That matters, because economic resistance requires health. Now add one more layer. Fast food corporations didn't operate alone, they coordinated. Clustering wasn't just about killing restaurants. It was about saturating attention. When multiple chains surround a neighborhood, they dominate visual space. They normalize consumption. They crowd out alternatives psychologically. Even if a healthier option appears, it looks abnormal. This is environmental control, and it works best when people believe they're choosing freely. By the time awareness campaigns started talking about nutrition, the environment was already hostile to change. You can't educate your way out of a rigged landscape, and corporations knew that. That's why they supported education campaigns. It shifted responsibility to individuals. Eat better, make smarter choices. Meanwhile, the environment stayed the same. No grocery stores, no affordable fresh food, no time. Blame shifted downward. Profit stayed upward. This is the pattern. Create dependency. Normalize harm. Deflect responsibility. And when criticism escalated, corporations deployed the final shield. Representation, black franchise owners, black executives, black spokespeople. The system didn't change. The optics did. This fractured opposition. Criticism became attacking black businesses. Structural analysis was drowned out by surface-level arguments. That wasn't accidental. It protected the core. By the mid-1990s, the transformation was complete. Local food systems were gone. Health outcomes were locked in. Capital flowed outward daily, and fast food wasn't seen as the cause. It was seen as normal. But here's the turning point we haven't addressed yet. Once this model proved effective, it didn't stay confined to food. Other industries copied it. Same neighborhoods, same tactics, same outcomes. So the real question becomes this: was fast food the problem, or was it the prototype? Fast food was the test case. Once corporations proved they could create dependency, extract wealth, and avoid blame, other industries followed the blueprint. Same neighborhoods, same conditions, same logic. Payday lenders moved in where banks had left. High fees, short-term relief, long-term damage. Rent-to-own furniture stores replaced traditional credit. Low weekly payments. Massive total cost. Ownership delayed or never reached. Predatory telecom plans. Prepaid contracts. Penalties for falling behind. No flexibility. None of this happened randomly. These industries studied the fast food rollout. They copied density strategies. They copied marketing language. They copied zoning pressure. The model was simple. Remove alternatives. Offer the only option. Normalize extraction. And it worked again. What fast food proved was this. You don't need overt discrimination to control outcomes. You just need infrastructure. By the mid-1990s, black neighborhoods weren't just underserved. They were overserved by harmful systems. Too many fast food outlets, too many lenders, too many low-quality options, not enough pathways out. This is where the conversation usually breaks down. People say, no one forced anyone to eat fast food. That's true. But no one offered real alternatives either. Choice only exists when options exist, and options had been systematically removed. This is why the focus on personal responsibility misses the point. Responsibility assumes access. Responsibility assumes time. Responsibility assumes flexibility. The environment denied all three. That's not culture. That's design. Now look at the money. Every day, cash flowed out of black neighborhoods, not reinvested, not recirculated, straight to corporate headquarters, straight to shareholders, straight to executive compensation. Local jobs existed, but ownership didn't. Wages were paid, but profits left. That difference matters. Communities don't build wealth on wages alone. They build it on ownership. Fast food removed ownership while pretending to offer it. That's the franchise illusion. Black franchise owners took loans, signed contracts, carried risk. Corporate owned the land, controlled the supply chain, set the rules. If sales dropped, the owner absorbed the loss. If sales surged, corporate captured the upside. That's not partnership. That's asymmetry. And when health consequences escalated, something else happened. Medical debt rose. Work capacity declined. Household stress increased. These outcomes weren't side effects. They reinforced dependency. Sicker communities are easier to exploit. Weaker communities resist less. That's not conspiracy language. That's economic reality. By the late 1990s, the numbers told the story clearly. Higher rates of diet-related illness, higher healthcare costs, lower life expectancy. Yet expansion continued. Why? Because the system didn't fail. It performed exactly as designed. Fast food corporations didn't need communities to thrive. They needed them to consume. Thriving communities demand better options. Struggling ones accept what's available. And now comes the final move. When criticism became unavoidable, corporations repositioned. They funded healthy initiatives, sponsored wellness campaigns, introduced limited menu changes, not to change outcomes, to manage perception. They framed the issue as education, as awareness, as lifestyle choice. The environment stayed unchanged. That's critical, because if the environment stays hostile, behavior doesn't shift. This allowed corporations to appear responsive while protecting the core business. And here's the result. The same corporations that helped create the problem positioned themselves as partners in the solution. They sponsored health research, donated to advocacy groups, influenced policy discussions, criticism softened, accountability faded. That's not redemption, that's containment. Now zoom out. This wasn't just about food, it was about control through necessity. Once you control necessities, you don't need force. People comply because they have to survive. Fast food showed how effective that control could be without visible oppression. No signs, no laws, no confrontation, just contracts, zoning, and marketing. And the impact didn't end with one generation. Children raised in these environments entered adulthood with normalized habits, normalized illness, normalized limits. That's the long game. Which brings us to the moment we're in now. Because the system only works as long as people believe it's normal, and the moment that belief breaks, the system weakens. So the real question isn't whether fast food harmed black communities. That's documented. The real question is this: now that the design is visible, what happens when communities stop participating? By the early 2000s, the damage was measurable. Life expectancy gaps widened. Medical costs exploded. Diet-related illness became common, not exceptional. This wasn't abstract. Emergency rooms in black neighborhoods saw conditions that barely existed there decades earlier. And still, the system held. Why? Because by then, fast food wasn't just a business. It was infrastructure. Entire daily routines were built around it. Work schedules, commutes, school pickups. When something becomes infrastructure, removing it feels impossible. That's what corporations were counting on. But something else happened around the same time. People started noticing patterns, not emotionally, numerically. Researchers mapped food access against health outcomes. The overlap was undeniable. More fast food density meant worse outcomes. Less grocery access meant shorter lifespans. These weren't opinions. They were data sets. Cities tried small interventions, nutrition programs, awareness campaigns. They failed. Not because people didn't care, because the environment didn't change. You can't out-educate a hostile system. That realization led to the next phase: resistance, not protests, construction. Urban farms appeared on vacant lots. Cooperative grocery stores reopened where chains refused to go. Community kitchens formed. These weren't lifestyle trends, they were countermeasures, and corporations noticed immediately. The response was fast. Lobbying intensified. Zoning restrictions tightened. Safety concerns were raised, permits delayed, funding blocked. Anything that threatened dependency was framed as impractical or risky. This is where intent becomes clear. If fast food corporations were simply responding to demand, they wouldn't fight alternatives, but they did. Every grocery cooperative that opened reduced consumption. Every urban farm reduced dependency. Every community kitchen reduced control, so they resisted all of it, quietly, legally, effectively. At the same time, corporations rebranded again. They adopted language of wellness, sustainability, community engagement. The core model stayed untouched: high-density locations, low-cost inputs, maximum volume. This is important because it shows the system doesn't collapse on its own. It has to be replaced, and replacement requires ownership, not individual behavior change, structural change. That's the part most conversations avoid. It's easier to talk about eating better than building alternatives, but the data is clear. Where communities regain food control, outcomes improve. Health stabilizes. Money circulates locally. Dependency decreases. Those changes threaten the model, which is why they're slow, underfunded, obstructed. Fast food corporations aren't afraid of criticism. They're afraid of replacement because replacement breaks the loop. No dependency, no extraction. That's why this history matters, not to assign guilt, to understand design. Once you see the design, you stop blaming individuals. You stop arguing culture. You start asking who controls access. That's the shift, and it leads to one unavoidable conclusion. Fast food didn't just harm black communities. It trained corporate America how to profit from neglect. Food was the entry point, but the strategy spread everywhere. Housing, finance, healthcare, the same playbook. Which means this story isn't finished. It's ongoing, and it ends one of two ways. Either communities rebuild control over necessities, or extraction continues quietly, indefinitely. That's the fork in the road, and the next piece matters more than all the rest, because it answers the final question. If the system was designed this way, who benefits from keeping it intact? Follow the benefit. Fast food corporations didn't design this system for communities. They designed it for investors. Public companies answer to one metric: return. Everything else is secondary. When fast food expanded into black neighborhoods, stock prices rose, revenue stabilized, growth accelerated. Why? Because dependency produces predictability. Predictable customers, predictable volume, predictable cash flow. Wall Street values predictability more than ethics. That's the incentive structure. Executives didn't need to ask whether outcomes were harmful. They needed to know whether outcomes were profitable, and they were. By the late 1990s, fast food was one of the most reliable revenue engines in the country. Urban locations outperformed expectations. Repeat consumption was higher. Margins were protected. Health costs didn't appear on corporate balance sheets. They appeared in public health care systems, in emergency rooms, in household debt. That separation mattered. When the cost of harm is externalized, harm becomes acceptable. That's not ideology. That's accounting. Now look at policy. Why didn't regulators intervene earlier? Because the system didn't look violent. It looked legal. No laws were broken. No explicit discrimination occurred. Permits were approved. Contracts were signed voluntarily. Consumers paid willingly. That's the genius of it. Control without coercion. Extraction without force. Policy responds to visible harm. This harm was slow, cumulative, and normalized. By the time data showed the impact, the system was entrenched, and dismantling infrastructure is politically expensive. Now, consider media. Fast food corporations were major advertisers. Television, radio, print. That buys silence. Investigative reporting costs money. Advertising revenue pays bills. Conflict of interest didn't need to be declared. It just existed. Stories focused on personal choice, lifestyle, responsibility. Structural analysis was rare. That wasn't coincidence. It was alignment. Then there's philanthropy. Corporations donated to community organizations, health nonprofits, youth programs. That created dependency in another direction. Organizations critical of fast food risked losing funding, so criticism softened. This wasn't bribery, it was leverage. Now add the franchise shield again. When backlash surfaced, corporations pointed to local owners, black-owned, community-based, entrepreneurial opportunity. That reframed the conversation. Critique became uncomfortable. Accountability diffused. The system stayed intact. And here's the key realization. None of this required malice. It required incentives. Executives didn't need to hate black communities. They needed quarterly growth. The system did the rest. That's why arguing intent misses the point. The design produced the outcome regardless of personal beliefs. Now zoom out further. Why were black neighborhoods especially vulnerable? Because they were already structurally weakened. Capital flight, underinvestment, limited political leverage. Fast food didn't create those conditions. It exploited them. That distinction matters because it means the same strategy will target any vulnerable population. And it has. Rural areas, low-income white communities, immigrant neighborhoods. The model scales, but it was perfected here. Which brings us to the present. The data is no longer hidden. Food access maps exist. Health correlations are clear. Economic extraction is documented. Yet the system continues. Why? Because dismantling it threatens profits, and profits are defended aggressively. Lobbying budgets reflect that. Marketing budgets reflect that. Legal teams reflect that. Fast food corporations are not passive participants. They are active defenders of the environment that sustains them. That's the reality. Now here's the shift that's happening. Communities are no longer arguing whether harm exists. They're building alternatives, and that's what changes the equation, because corporations can manage criticism. They can't manage replacement. Every grocery cooperative weakens density. Every urban farm disrupts dependency. Every local restaurant breaks predictability. That's why these efforts face resistance. Not because they don't work, because they do. And this leads to the final uncomfortable truth. The system isn't waiting to be fixed. It's waiting to be outgrown. No amount of awareness will dismantle it. No amount of education alone will change it. Only control over access will. Which brings us to the last question. If communities reclaim food systems, what else becomes possible? Because food was never the end goal, it was the entry point. Once communities started rebuilding food access, something changed fast. Outcomes shifted, not overnight, but measurably. Neighborhoods with even one full-service grocery store saw improved diet patterns. Areas with urban farms showed lower food insecurity. Cooperative models kept money circulating locally. This wasn't theory, it was data, which explains the resistance. Because rebuilding food systems does more than improve health. It restores leverage. When people aren't dependent on a single option, pricing power collapses. When money stays local, extraction slows. When health improves, productivity and resistance increase. That threatens more than fast food. It threatens the broader extraction economy. That's why food justice initiatives face barriers that don't match their scale. Zoning delays, funding denials, endless impact studies. Meanwhile, fast food permits remain automatic. Same cities, different rules. That tells you everything. This system isn't broken, it's defended. Now let's be clear about something. Fast food corporations didn't invent exploitation. They optimized it. They showed how to turn neglect into profit without visible force. That's why the model spread. Once you understand that, the conversation shifts. This isn't about burgers. It's about control over necessities, food, housing, credit, healthcare. Whoever controls access controls outcomes. Fast food just proved how efficient that control could be, which is why the narrative stays shallow. If people understood the system, they'd stop arguing about choices and start demanding infrastructure. And infrastructure is harder to control from a boardroom. That's the risk. So the response has been consistent. Redirect attention, personalize blame, celebrate surface level diversity. Anything that avoids structural change. But here's what can't be avoided anymore: the numbers. Life expectancy gaps tied to diet, healthcare costs tied to food access, economic drain tied to franchising. These aren't opinions, they're receipts. And they lead to one unavoidable conclusion. Fast food didn't just fill a gap, it replaced a system that once supported ownership, health, and local control. And when that system was removed, something worse took its place, not because people wanted it, because it was all that was left. That's the part that gets erased. This wasn't a cultural failure, it was a structural takeover. And once you see it that way, the future becomes a choice, not between burgers and salads, between dependency and control, between extraction and ownership, because the system only survives as long as participation feels inevitable. The moment communities decide it isn't, everything changes. So the real ending isn't a warning, it's a decision. Do we keep treating fast food like convenience, or do we finally call it what it has been all along? A system designed to profit from neglect. Calling it convenience was the cover story. The reality is this system worked because it replaced choice with inevitability. When grocery stores disappeared, fast food didn't compete. It defaulted. When local restaurants closed, chains didn't win customers. They inherited them. That difference matters. Competition implies agency. Inheritance implies control. By the time fast food saturation was complete, behavior didn't need persuasion. It was automatic. That's when the system became self-sustaining. People born into these neighborhoods didn't switch habits. They inherited environments. That's how structural harm outlasts intention. Now look at the timeline. Before the late 1960s, diet-related illness at current levels didn't exist in Black communities. After fast food saturation, it spiked. Same population, same culture, different infrastructure. That eliminates cultural explanations. Infrastructure changed outcomes, and infrastructure didn't appear by accident. It followed abandonment, then policy, then corporate entry. That sequence repeats everywhere extraction succeeds. This is why calling it personal choice is misleading. Choice without access isn't choice. Choice without alternatives is compliance. The system depends on that confusion. As long as people argue behavior, no one interrogates design. That's intentional. Now here's what breaks the loop. Replacement, not reform. Fast food corporations can absorb criticism. They can adapt menus. They can rebrand. They can't survive mass disengagement. When grocery cooperatives open, fast food revenue drops. When local restaurants return, density loses power. When food is no longer scarce, marketing loses influence. That's why resistance looks slow, because it has to rebuild what was removed. And rebuilding infrastructure takes time. But the direction matters more than speed. Every community that regains food control weakens the model. That's why opposition intensifies right when projects start working. That's not coincidence. The system defends itself. Which brings us to the final clarity. Fast food didn't just change what people ate. It changed how power moved. Money flowed out instead of circulating. Health declined instead of stabilizing. Ownership disappeared instead of compounding. That wasn't incidental. It was the outcome of a model designed to monetize neglect. And models don't end because people feel bad about them. They end when participation stops. So the question isn't whether fast food caused harm. That's settled. The question is whether communities accept inevitability or rebuild alternatives. Because once the system is seen clearly, neutrality disappears. You're either feeding it or replacing it. There isn't a middle position, and that's where this story actually ends. Not in the past, in the decision happening now. What gets built next determines whether this model survives or collapses, and that choice isn't theoretical anymore. It's already being made every day by who controls the food. In. Here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. This system didn't survive because people didn't know. It survived because leaving it is hard. Fast food became woven into survival routines. Long work hours, low wages, limited transportation. Cooking wasn't just a preference issue. It became a time issue. That matters. When systems demand more labor and give less return, people choose speed over quality. Corporations built around that reality. They didn't create exhaustion. They monetized it. And once exhaustion becomes permanent, bad options feel normal. That's the trap. Now look at how change actually happens. It doesn't start with awareness campaigns. Those come last. It starts when infrastructure shifts. When grocery access increases, fast food sales drop. That's been measured. When people have time and tools, behavior follows. Not the other way around. This proves something critical. The problem was never discipline. It was design, which means the solution isn't guilt. It's construction. And that's why the system fights construction so hard. Not because alternatives don't work, because they do. Every successful community food project exposes the lie that fast food is inevitable. It shows that outcomes can change when access changes. That's dangerous to a model built on permanence. So resistance looks bureaucratic, not violent. Permits stalled, funding delayed, endless compliance hurdles, nothing dramatic, just slow suffocation. Meanwhile, fast food keeps expanding. That tells you where power sits. Now step back one last time. Fast food was never just about food. It was a training ground. It showed corporate America how to profit from scarcity without fixing it. That lesson stuck. And it explains why similar patterns appear everywhere communities lack leverage. Same logic, different products. So here's the final clarity. This story isn't about the past, it's about recognition. Once people see how the system works, they stop blaming themselves, they stop arguing culture, they stop chasing individual fixes, they start asking who controls access. That's when real pressure begins, because systems can survive ignorance, they can survive criticism, they can't survive replacement. That's the point we're at now. And that's why this history matters, not to relive damage, but to recognize design. Because once design is visible, participation becomes a choice, and systems built on inevitability don't survive choice. That's the end of the story, unless people decide it isn't. Let's strip this down to the core. Fast food didn't dominate black neighborhoods because of taste. It didn't dominate because of culture. It didn't dominate because people didn't care. It dominated because systems removed alternatives first. Insurance left, banks left, grocery stores left. Fast food arrived last. That sequence matters. You can't judge choices made inside a trap without acknowledging who built the trap. This wasn't about ignorance. It was about constraint. Once food access collapsed, fast food became infrastructure. Once it became infrastructure, it shaped health. Once it shaped health, it shaped productivity. Once it shaped productivity, it shaped wealth. That's the chain. And once wealth stops circulating locally, everything else weakens. Schools, healthcare, housing. Food was the entry point, but the outcome was total economic exposure. That's why this story keeps repeating, because when one necessity is captured, Others follow. Now here's the part that matters most. This system only works when people believe it's normal. The moment it's recognized as engineered, the spell breaks. That's why awareness alone was never enough, but awareness paired with construction is dangerous. When people rebuild food access, they reclaim time, they reclaim health, they reclaim leverage, and leverage changes negotiations. Fast food corporations know this. That's why they resist replacement harder than criticism. Criticism doesn't change cash flow. Replacement does. So this isn't a morality story. It's a power story. Who controls access to necessities controls outcomes. Fast food proved that quietly, efficiently, and legally. That's why it's spread. That's why it's defended. That's why it's still here. But systems built on inevitability fail the moment inevitability is questioned, and that question is now unavoidable. Do communities accept a system that profits from neglect, or do they rebuild one that circulates life instead of extracting it? There is no neutral position anymore. Participation feeds the system. Replacement starves it. That's the real choice, and it's already being made, block by block. At this point, one thing should be clear. This system didn't survive because it was hidden. It survived because it was tolerated. Once fast food became normalized, resistance slowed. People adapted instead of challenging the structure. That wasn't weakness, that was survival. When options are limited, people optimize within constraints. Corporations counted on that. They didn't need loyalty, they needed routine. Once eating patterns locked in, revenue stabilized. Once revenue stabilized, expansion continued, and because everything was legal, there was no emergency response, no hearings, no shutdowns, just quiet continuation. This is why change took so long. Harm that accumulates slowly rarely triggers urgency, but here's where the shift finally happened. Healthcare systems started collapsing under the cost. Public spending ballooned. Outcomes diverged too sharply to ignore. At that point, the damage was no longer contained inside neighborhoods. It spread outward. Taxpayers absorbed medical costs. Hospitals absorbed overload. Cities absorbed instability. That's when the conversation changed. Not because lives were lost, because money was. That's how systems respond. And once attention turned to cost, the model was exposed. Cheap food wasn't cheap. It was deferred cost, paid later, by everyone. This reframes the issue completely. Fast food wasn't just extracting from black communities, it was shifting cost onto the public. Private profit, public burden. That's the definition of a failed system, and it explains why cities are now conflicted. They depend on fast food for jobs and tax revenue, but they pay for the health fallout. That contradiction can't last forever. Something has to give. And historically, when systems reach that point, one of two things happens. They reform under pressure, or they collapse under replacement. Fast food corporations are betting on reform. Menu tweaks, marketing shifts, surface changes. Communities pushing back are betting on replacement, ownership, access, local control. Those two paths don't coexist. One preserves the system, the other ends it. And now the conflict is visible. Zoning fights, permit battles, funding wars. This isn't about food anymore. It's about who decides what neighborhoods become. That decision used to be made quietly. It isn't anymore. Which means the next phase won't be subtle. It will be structural. And once structures start changing, the narrative will shift fast. Because history doesn't change gradually when power is involved, it snaps. The only unanswered question is where. And who moves first? By the time cities started questioning fast food density, the system was already entrenched. Local governments faced a bind. Fast food locations generated jobs. They generated tax revenue. They filled empty lots quickly. That made them politically convenient. Short-term stability beat long-term health. City councils didn't ask whether fast food should dominate. They asked how to manage the consequences quietly. That's an important distinction. Once a system becomes economically embedded, removing it feels like self-harm to local budgets. Corporations understood this early. They didn't just sell food. They sold dependency to cities, jobs that couldn't be replaced easily, tax streams that looked reliable, quick development that avoided deeper investment. That bought protection. When communities complained, officials pointed to employment numbers. When health advocates raised alarms, officials cited revenue. Fast food became too big to touch, and that status wasn't accidental. Corporations cultivated it. They negotiated tax abatements. They secured long-term leases. They locked in zoning advantages. Once those agreements were signed, reversal became legally expensive. That's how systems harden. Now add one more factor: political turnover. Elected officials cycle every few years. Infrastructure decisions last decades. Fast food corporations planned long. Cities planned short. That mismatch mattered. By the time outcomes became obvious, the decision makers were gone and the contracts remained. This is why accountability felt impossible. There was no single villain, no single vote, no single moment to undo. Just accumulated decisions pointing in the same direction. Now look at public messaging during this period. Fast food corporations frame themselves as partners, economic anchors, community employers. They sponsored city events. They funded scholarships. They showed up where optics mattered. That wasn't generosity. It was insulation. The more embedded they appeared, the harder it was to challenge them without backlash. Critics were framed as anti-jobs, anti-development, out of touch. The conversation stayed narrow on purpose. Health was treated as personal. Economics was treated as collective. That split protected the system, because once harm is individualized, no one addresses structure. This is why progress stalled, not because evidence was weak, because incentives were misaligned. Cities needed revenue, corporations provided it, communities paid the cost, and that cost kept rising. By the 2000s, the numbers were impossible to ignore. Diet-related illness consumed massive portions of public health care budgets. Productivity losses mounted. Emergency services were stretched. Fast food wasn't just affecting neighborhoods anymore. It was affecting cities as a whole. That's when the tone shifted. Not to justice, to sustainability. Officials began asking whether this model was financially viable long-term. That's a critical moment, because systems don't change when they're immoral. They change when they're expensive, and fast food had become expensive, not to corporations, to everyone else. This opened a crack. Cities began exploring density caps, zoning revisions, incentives for grocery stores, not aggressively, cautiously, but even small shifts mattered. Every restriction signaled vulnerability. Every alternative suggested replacement was possible. Corporations responded predictably. Lobbying increased. Legal challenges followed. Messaging reframed fast food as choice and freedom. The same playbook: delay, deflect, deny. But the environment had changed. Data was public. Outcomes were visible. Communities were organized. This wasn't the 1970s anymore. Information moved faster, coordination improved. That's when the conflict entered a new phase. Not expansion versus neglect, but preservation versus transition. Fast food corporations were no longer growing unchecked. They were defending territory. That's a sign of maturity. And mature systems don't collapse quietly, they resist. Which brings us to the final setup. If this system is now being defended instead of expanded, that means it's vulnerable, and vulnerability changes behavior. The next question matters more than everything before it. When a system built on dependency, saint. When systems feel threatened, they reveal priorities. Fast food corporations stopped expanding aggressively and started protecting territory. That's the signal. They fought density limits, they fought zoning changes, they fought incentives for grocery stores. Not because they feared competition in theory, because competition worked in practice. Every neighborhood that gained alternatives reduced dependence. Sales dipped, traffic shifted, predictability broke. That's the risk investors don't like. So the response intensified. Lobbyists pushed consumer choice language. Marketing reframed fast food as freedom. Legal teams challenged city authority. This wasn't about food access anymore. It was about control over space. Who gets to exist in a neighborhood and who doesn't? That fight exposed something important. Fast food corporations didn't see themselves as one option among many. They saw themselves as the option. That mindset only exists when dominance has been normalized. Now here's what changed the power balance. Data became unavoidable. Maps showing fast food density overlaid perfectly with illness rates. Economic studies showed money leaving neighborhoods daily. Public health care costs were traced back to diet patterns. This wasn't ideology, it was accounting. Once numbers told the story, arguments about culture collapsed. You couldn't blame habits when infrastructure predicted outcomes. That shifted leverage. Cities could no longer pretend this was neutral development. Health departments could no longer stay silent. Budget offices couldn't ignore long-term cost. That's when replacement stopped sounding radical and started sounding practical, not idealistic, necessary. Which is why the most effective resistance didn't come from protests. It came from pilots, small grocery co-ops, mobile markets, urban agriculture, projects that proved alternatives worked without needing permission. Every successful pilot made the system look optional, and optional systems lose power fast. Corporations tried to slow these efforts with regulation and delays, but the logic had shifted. Officials started asking different questions, not "can this work?" but "why didn't we do this earlier?" That's a dangerous moment for any entrenched system, because once replacement is seen as feasible, defense becomes reactive. Fast food corporations had spent decades planning defense. They weren't built for this phase. This is where history usually turns. Not when systems are exposed, but when they're outperformed. Fast food's advantage was speed and scale in a vacuum. Once the vacuum closes, the advantage shrinks. And now the vacuum is closing, slowly, unevenly, but measurably, which leads to the final phase. Not awareness, not critique, transition. And transitions don't ask permission. They happen where people decide the cost of staying is higher than the cost of building. That decision is already happening. The only question left is scale. Because once enough neighborhoods flip, the model doesn't reform, it collapses. Once replacement started working, the narrative flipped. Fast food corporations stopped talking about growth and started talking about survival. You can see it in their filings. You can see it in their messaging. More community partnerships, more health initiatives. Same core model. That tells you something. They're not adapting, they're buying time because the math has shifted. When alternatives exist, fast food loses its advantage, not slowly, immediately. People don't need convincing, they need access. Where grocery stores return, fast food traffic drops. Where local restaurants reopen, density stops working. Where food is no longer scarce, marketing loses power. That's the weakness. Fast food only dominates when it's the default. Remove default status and it becomes optional. Optional businesses don't control outcomes. That's why the pushback has escalated. Legal challenges to zoning caps. Threats of store closures framed as job losses. Pressure campaigns on city councils. This is defensive behavior. Systems confident in permanence don't act like this. Now zoom out. This isn't just about food anymore. It's about precedent. If communities successfully reclaim food systems, it proves something dangerous to corporate power. That extraction models can be reversed, not reformed, replaced. And once that's proven in one sector, others follow. That's the fear, because the same logic applies to housing, to finance, to healthcare. Food was just the easiest entry point. Low margins, high volume, low political resistance. If that can be undone, nothing else feels untouchable. That's why fast food corporations are fighting so hard now. Not because they care about burgers, because they care about the blueprint. Lose the blueprint and decades of quiet control collapse. This is the moment most people misunderstand. They think the system ends when corporations apologize or add healthier items. It doesn't. It ends when participation drops and alternatives scale. That's already happening. Not everywhere, but enough to matter. Which means the final phase isn't theoretical, it's operational. Who gets funded? What gets permitted? Which neighborhoods get investment? Those decisions are being made right now, quietly, again. And history says this part determines everything, because once the balance tips, systems don't recover, they get replaced. And that brings us to the last question of this story. If fast food was the first system to prove how profitable neglect could be, what happens when neglect stops paying? When neglect stops paying, the system ends. Not because corporations admit fault, because investors leave. Fast food dominance was built on one assumption that certain neighborhoods would stay desperate. Once that assumption breaks, the model fails. Not morally, financially. That's already happening. Costs are rising. Margins are thinner. Traffic is less predictable. Healthcare pressure has forced cities to act. Public spending can't absorb the damage forever. At the same time, alternatives are scaling. Not fast, but steadily. And scale is what matters. Fast food never won because it was better. It won because it was alone. The moment it isn't alone, it loses power. That's the truth underneath everything. This wasn't a cultural collapse. It was a forced narrowing of options. And now the narrowing is reversing, which means the story people tell themselves has to change. Fast food didn't save neighborhoods. It filled space after others were pushed out. It didn't empower communities. It extracted from them. It didn't appear naturally. It followed abandonment, policy, and profit. Once you accept that, the conclusion is simple. This system doesn't need to be protested. It needs to be replaced. Replacement doesn't look dramatic. It looks boring. Grocery stores reopening, local restaurants returning, food co-ops expanding, ownership coming back. That's what ends it. And when people ask how this happened for so long, the answer won't be confusion. It will be clarity, because the design was always visible. It just wasn't named. Now it is. And systems that depend on silence don't survive being understood. That's the end of the story, unless people decide to ignore it. And this time, they know exactly what that costs.